It's our single biggest cluster, a wedding in Bluff where Covid-19 has spread to nearly 100 people and killed 2, including the groom's father.
The Ministry of Health is saddened to report 2 further deaths linked to Covid-19. The first individual is a man in his 80s who died at Wellington Public Hospital yesterday. This gentleman had a link to an established cluster.
The cluster's been officially linked to overseas travel. An Air New Zealand flight attendant who just returned from the United States and had already been exposed to coronavirus was at the wedding reception. These are the words of an Air New Zealand employee, revoiced to protect their identity.
On 19 March, NZ5 arrived at Auckland from LAX, on which 3 passengers tested positive for COVID-19. At least 2 crew later tested positive. A crew member from that flight, before testing positive, went down to Bluff to attend a wedding. And now we all know about the Bluff cluster.
To understand how that was even possible, given the serious clampdown on international travellers moving around the country, we need to reverse up a little. Just 4 days earlier, the Prime Minister had announced compulsory 14-day self-isolation for anyone arriving in New Zealand from around the world, excluding the Pacific.
As of midnight Sunday, every person entering New Zealand, including returning New Zealand citizens and residents, will be required to enter self-isolation for 14 days. Everybody.
Despite the clampdown, Air New Zealand crew remained exempt at the time and under earlier isolation rules too, and have largely maintained that exemption throughout this pandemic. Here's Air New Zealand's shareholding minister Grant Robertson just last night. Are Air New Zealand staff who are still flying internationally exempt from the quarantine for 14 days?
As my understanding, Lisa, if that continues to be the case, yes, that exemption was granted at the very, very beginning. It allows our flights to be able to move both people and goods around. Of course, there are very, very few international flights. Checkpoint
can reveal that's despite employees repeatedly raising concerns that the lack of isolation for returning crews was endangering them and other people. A letter sent to Air New Zealand management earlier this month starkly lays out the issue.
An Air New Zealand flight arrived at Auckland from which 3 passengers tested positive for COVID-19, 1 in each class throughout the aircraft. 4 crew later tested positive. Another crew member from that same flight, before testing positive, attended meetings, then embarked on a 4-night tour of duty. One of those meetings was attended by yourself. If the 14-day separation rule was in place, that crew member would have remained in self-isolation at home and would not have placed other members of the community or colleagues at risk of COVID-19.
Ministry of Health guidelines exempt aircrew from 14-day stand-downs between different flights, as long as they appear healthy. But the same letter notes these protocols are minimum guidelines, and Air New Zealand has sufficient surplus crew to accommodate a mandatory 14-day stand-down between flight duties to allow for the virus incubation period.
Any socially responsible business that goes above and beyond these minimum requirements is helping create an environment where social transmission of COVID-19 is reduced. We urge you to implement the recommended 14-day stand-down between duties.
Air New Zealand's response shortly, but this is not the first time the airline had been asked to tighten the rules. This from a March letter from union reps to management.
Regrettably, yesterday we learned that there are now 6 Air New Zealand staff who have tested positive for COVID-19. All of these cases are linked to overseas travel. While we wish to protect these individuals' privacy, it is entirely reasonable to surmise that all cases are cabin crew or pilots. We believe it is time to implement a hard 14-day separation rule between all duties to ensure the risk of crew unintentionally spreading this COVID-19 virus is mitigated.
The letter goes on to say it's almost certain there'll be further crew infections, and the current cases indicate assumptions made by the Ministry of Health around flight crew protocols must be wrong, as crew are still contracting the virus despite following the recommended procedure. Remember, about 40% of coronavirus cases in New Zealand are directly linked to overseas travel.
Rudders check, engine check. You guys ready? Take off. Yeah. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Janie. Kia ora and welcome aboard this Air New Zealand flight. It's important you obey your crew member instructions, placards and illuminated signs.
Air New Zealand is a company that prides itself on its safety messages. But in an email dated March 28, it landed on this response to repeated requests for mandatory isolation for all crew.
We are looking into this. Currently, the advice from our medical team will stand for now. As per the alert level, crew will be required to self-isolate in between duties. Air NZ flight attendants are considered to be essential workers and therefore have dispensation to come to work on the provision they are fully fit for work.
So at level 4, crew are supposed to stay at home between flying jobs. But unlike any other passengers coming to New Zealand from overseas, they can get on another flight with potentially hundreds of other people within the incubation period for the virus. The 2 letters raising these grave concerns were sent after the Bluff wedding on March 21st. But a trail of documents obtained by Checkpoint shows as early as January, questions were being asked about the crew quarantine exemption. It's discussed again in February. The advice remains the same: no quarantine required.
This is your final call, thank you.
Kia ora, welcome.
There's also talk about whether it's still safe to hand out sweets, should headrest covers be changed each flight and TV screens cleaned down too. Here's a sample of the minutes from Air New Zealand's regular health and safety meetings.
Crew said they had seen someone sneezing into blanket and threw blanket out. Don't have faith in our cleaning of blankets. Should we be putting into biohazard kit?
We only had 16 pairs of gloves on the aircraft. We requested to have more and there were no gloves that they could bring up due to nil stock.
And there's a scramble to source gloves and masks for crew. Back to those minutes.
This is not a burn, but why do we have to be so reactive? All the work we have been doing is fantastic, but why did we not expect a pandemic to occur? Why didn't we plan for our people and with stock, and we are now scrambling?
Here's what the whistleblower told Checkpoint about protective gear.
There were constant supply issues with many flights departing without adequate protection available. Aircrew were also advised on board pandemic resources were not to be used for general protection and sent a stern reminder doing so may result in disciplinary action being taken.
The Ministry of Health guidelines for crew overnighting in other countries include: wear a surgical mask if on public transport, avoid sightseeing, shopping and any unnecessary trips to public places, remain in the hotel room, including using room service, maintain physical distance from other crew during layover. But at a March 31st health and safety meeting, questions were being raised about whether Air New Zealand crew were following the rules. Here's the notes attributed to the airline's medical officer.
Contact tracing and reviews we are doing are rigorous to determine whether crew were exposed. We believe they were probably exposed on layovers. MOH guidance for layovers is pretty rigid. Not going out using room service, etc. Suspect that's where the process could be breaking down. Some issues with hotels providing food and requiring crew to go out.
Ministry of Health guidelines to airline crew clearly state any crew not following the layover advice must self-isolate away from their bubble for 14 days on return to New Zealand. The same guidelines say airlines need to monitor the effectiveness of COVID controls, and if risks are identified, the airline should impose additional controls. The issue of layover compliance is raised again on April 3 and is in the minutes from an April 7th meeting.
Issues with crew not adhering to the Ministry of Health Social Responsibilities Bulletin whilst on layovers. How can we assist in delivering this important message?
At the same meeting, it's noted a 14-day separation is being introduced for crew duties to LA due to high community spread. No mention of other destinations though. And questions are being asked about exactly how many Air New Zealand staff have contracted the virus. Here's the transcript of the minutes.
Whilst absolutely respecting crew privacy and without discussing specifics, can we please know how many cruise pilots have tested positive for the virus? How many cruise pilots are requiring hospitalisation? Number of recovered.
The short answer from Dr. John Chalkley, Air New Zealand's medical officer: No, because of the need to preserve the privacy of a vulnerable group of employees. That's despite others arguing the information could help change crew behaviour and heighten awareness. An Air New Zealand worker whose words are spoken by someone else says the information is key to assessing the risk they're exposed to.
It is clear that the numbers of crew infected has become embarrassing for the Air New Zealand brand. Air New Zealand continually maintains our job as low risk, yet we can't independently assess that assurance without knowing the rate at which our colleagues have been infected. The Air New Zealand brand seems more important than their employees and the country which they call home.
Air New Zealand has repeatedly declined to tell us how many of its staff have contracted COVID-19. Even Grant Robertson, who's the shareholding minister in the 52% government-owned company, says he doesn't know.
Oh, look, I don't have up-to-date statistics on that. There was a handful of them in the early days of New Zealanders returning.
OK, are you able to find that number out for us?
Sure, absolutely.
And even after the government announced further border restrictions, including 14-day isolation at a managed facility earlier this month, flight crew kept their exemption.